Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. If you have not been following ASA on Facebook, you're making a very serious error in judgment. I encourage you to quickly go to the ASA Facebook page and follow ASA. You'll find out all about upcoming events, funding opportunities, calls for papers, and much more. So please help support ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, once again, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from the lovely city of Hobart, the island of Tasmania. And this week, I'm really lucky to be joined by a very prominent name in the animal studies world, and that is Helen Tiffin. Now, Helen has a number of different affiliations, which she might be willing to talk to us about in a minute, but the important thing is to get to her book chapter. So today we're going to discuss her upcoming book chapter, which is called Australian Conservation Policies and the Owls of Lord Howe Island. Now, that chapter is going to appear in a book which will be published by Brill. The book is going to come out later this year, so in 2019, and it's going to be edited by... Helen, do you want to say the name? I've got a funny feeling I'm going to mess it up.
Beate Neumier.
Beate Neumier from the University of Wollongong. And anyway, welcome to the podcast, Helen.
Thank you.
So, Helen, why this article? Why did you write this?
I wrote this because I currently live on Lord Howe Island, have done so for the last 11 years, though I was a visitor there for 30 years before that, so I got to know the island very well. It's quite isolated. It's 700 kilometres off the Australian coast, though still a part of New South Wales, and it's also a World Heritage Area, particularly for its bird population. Although it also is quite famous for having so many species of endemic plants. But very recently, we have had a problem here that raises the issue of animal welfare versus conservation policies and practices. And this, I find, is always a tragic clash in a way, because what you're doing, bringing two people or two areas into conflict that really should be and could be united against the majority who care very little for either animal welfare or indeed environmental conservation. And of course, since animal welfare as a whole, especially wild animal welfare, depends on preservation of habitat, environmental protection and environmental studies are crucially important in many ways to animal welfare. But as has been pointed out in the past, they frequently find themselves at odds. And this is something Freya Matthews has talked about. It's also been spoken about in a wonderful article called Animal Rights and Environmental Practice, Bad Marriage, Quick Divorce. And it's a problem that has always interested me theoretically, but increasingly I've now been involved in it in a coalface situation, because at Lord Howe we're now facing a situation where animal welfare is being totally sacrificed to environmental preservation. And that is animal welfare in terms of both wild animal welfare, specifically land birds and domestic animals, to in fact carry out a rat eradication policy, the basis of which is pretty shaky to start with, since rats, and this is the European rat, Rattus rattus, rats have been on the island for 100 years. This is not ideal, of course, but in 100 years they've in fact come to an ecological balance, albeit an uneasy one, with the rest of the biota. However, the federal government, inspired by the New Zealand, what is it called, get rid of predators policy by 2050, and was initially doing this with 1080, but changed to a hemorrhagic poison called broadafricum fairly recently, inspired by that New Zealand push, offered islands the possibility of eliminating rats with broadafricum, and in fact awarded applicants from Lord Howe, the Parks and Wildlife applicants, $10 million to eradicate rats from Lord Howe. On the surface, this would seem to be an excellent idea, but in practice, it is indeed a very bad one. It has been bad for both potentially domestic animals and indeed a lot of the biota. Those animals that are said to be under threat of extinction from rats have been under threat of extinction from rats for at least 100 years, but have not so far shown any major downturn in population. Neither has the rat population increased. So a draconian drop of 42 tonnes to 50 tonnes of the toxic agent broadafricum across the entire island has meant not only a major split in the human community, but it has also meant that at least 10 species of land birds might become what is casually referred to as by-kill, inevitable by-kill in pursuit of the rat eradication. A number of us have been very against this, both because of the disruption to the human community and their domestic animals. Initially, it was said that all chickens and all cows would have to be slaughtered, all dogs would have to be taken to the mainland or muzzled for 4 months during this eradication procedure, and as well, people will not be able to eat fish for 4 months to up to 2 years caught off the island, because broadafricum accumulates in fish livers. This should not affect the coral, because you have to have a circulatory system for a hemorrhagic like broadafricum to act in that way, but nevertheless the effect on fish is a bad one, and as well as the bird by-kill, which is admitted by the proponents, there seems very little chance that rats will be actually eradicated. On Henderson Island in the Pacific, where the cliffs are not nearly as daunting as those on Lord Howe, and where it was much easier to spread the poison, 10 to 50 rats escaped, and Henderson Island now has double the number of rats it had before this. So what we're doing is we're facing an eradication which potentially and very likely will fail, but will result in particularly unpleasant hemorrhagic deaths up to 4 to 6 days. Broadafricum takes to kill both rats and birds, potentially unpleasant hemorrhagic death of rats, and a bykill that is, in my view at least, unconscionable in relation to land birds and potentially some seabirds. However, the federal government and state government seem determined to try this because, as New Zealand spokesperson said earlier, we are not very good at eradicating rats from inhabited islands. We need an island to try this out on. 2 New Zealand islands refused to do this, and so we have become the guinea pigs for both Australia and New Zealand. And worse, our animals and birds have become the guinea pigs for this experiment.
Helen, do you care to describe how the rats die? Do you know that? Is that something you can share with the listeners?
The rats and the birds that will be part of the bykill die as the nearest thing in human disease is Ebola, where in fact the walls of the capillaries gradually dissolve and the bleeding then affects one organ after another. It's an extremely painful death and quite long-winded. It can be up to 4 to 6 days.
So owls are an important part of the story that you tell in the book chapter. Can you say something about how owls relate to the rat extinction and what's likely to happen to them as a result?
The owls will also, it would seem, be eradicated, but they are less bykill than being up to a point deliberately targeted. Owls were imported at various times into Lord Howe, different strains of owls from both the Australian mainland, from San Diego in the United States, and from Tasmania. But although, of course, the owl diet became rats and mice, the owls never succeeded in gaining a population sufficiently large to wipe out the rats, although they have exercised, to a degree, a small control on that population. Up to this point, control has been seen as a very effective way of keeping the rat population down. However, now that total eradication has become the fashion, the fear is that if the owls were allowed to live and the rats, who to a small degree prey on seabird eggs, are also eliminated, the owls will themselves start preying on seabirds. The second thing about the owls is that they're not considered endemic, and the only 2 species of birds on Lord Howe that will be protected from this all-out poisoning measure, the woodhen and the Lord Howe Island currawong, are endemics. And because they're endemics, found nowhere else at all, they're going to be protected to the point where 126 of each species will be incarcerated during the poison drop and for a period of months thereafter, so that they won't be eating the poison or the rats that have been poisoned by it. And therefore 126 in the view of Parks and Wildlife is enough to resuscitate the population, irrespective of the number of others that will die. The Lord Howe Island woodhen, for instance, was at one point the rarest bird on Earth. They were down to 12. 12 were living on the top of Mount Gower, let me say, with the rats. The rats were no threat to them. And the woodhen was brought back from the brink of extinction by a wonderful breeding program that has now put their population at 250 to such a degree that they were to be brought off the critically endangered list, but that now, because of the poison drop, they have to be put back on the critically endangered list. And in so doing, at least 74 of them or more will actually suffer this hemorrhagic death because only 126 will be captured. The owls, if they don't eat the poison directly, will in fact, and probably this is the major way they will be killed, they will eat the dead or dying rats. Now, the owls are not considered endemic. They're not even considered native because they were brought in deliberately by humans from somewhere else. And Parks and Wildlife sticks to this policy of trying to return every environment to 1788, which is in so many ways a very artificial date of European arrival in Australia. But because the owls were not there in 1788, because in fact once their food source, the rats, or at least a proportion of them, will disappear, they will need to be eradicated as well. And nobody's particularly bothered by that. And an interesting irony is that because the owls over time, the San Diego strain died out, the owls over time have become a mixture of the Tasmanian owl and the New South Wales mainland owl. They cannot in fact be returned to Tasmania or to New South Wales, even though their crossbreeding in fact makes them in some ways the rarest owls in the world, which will now be wiped out.
Wow. Well, Helen, as you've suggested, this has had a big this has generated a big split among people living on Lord Howe Island. Can you tell me something about how the communities responded to all of this?
There have always been, in any small community, and Lord Howe has a permanent population of 350, and I might add that this is the first island in the entire world with a permanent population on which such a poison drop has ever been carried out. So we're very much guinea pigs, very much an experiment. The possibility of this has been around for well over 14 years. It's initially fought by most of the community, but you need to take into account, of course, the fact that some of that community are Parks and Wildlife employees and representatives. So at least 100 islanders remain utterly opposed to what is being made to happen to them, to their domestic animals, to their way of life. And this has caused a massive split in the population between those who hope to profit in some way from this experiment and those who are totally and completely against it. And it has become a particularly vicious split in small communities. You always get splits of various kinds, but I think most people would agree this is by far the worst that has ever occurred in the human community. It also means that food sources, for instance, within that community are being disrupted. Milk, a concession has been made to allow some of the milking cows to live, but the The cows will still have to be milked, but the milk will not be able to be drunk for at least several months. The cows will be in danger of picking up baits. Presumably they can be revived by vitamin K injections, but because Brodaphacum is bioaccumulative in mammalian as well as fish livers and bird livers, that stays there as a potential for harm. Many people in the community, of course, are also worried about their children. Again, if children would have to eat an enormous number of pellets to be affected, but the long-term effects of Brodaphacum's bioaccumulation in the liver are simply unknown.
So, Helen, this points to a very long-standing conflict between environmental activists and animal rights activists, and also a kind of a division that we see in the literature, perhaps between those who prioritise species and those who prioritise individual animals. Do you have any thoughts on whether we're moving any closer towards reconciling this or finding a way forward?
The only person that I can see, well, there are two really. Kay Milton has done some work on this that moves towards it. Freya Matthews, and I quote Freya Matthews extensively in the article that I've written, both goes into the background of the split in, I think, a way that's very instructive, and also concludes that we have to find some balance here. Her argument tends to end by suggesting that we try to let nature take its course, to not interfere at this level. I would add to that where environmental preservation of endangered species is important, we have to do this subtly, and we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. This is what has not happened at Lord Howe. What's happened at Lord Howe is that it's simply been said some species are probably endangered by the rats that have been here 100 years. No real estimation of the rat population, and rat populations are very hard to estimate anyway. No real estimation has been done. Worse, there has been no recognition of the fact that the rat population has not increased over the last 50 years, which is an indicator that the species that are claimed to be threatened are not nearly as threatened as they might be. So in the case of Lord Howe, I think there's an immediate solution that this has just not been subtly enough dealt with. It's not been specifically enough dealt with. But if we take those two issues aside from the case of Lord Howe, whether we're any closer to a solution is very hard to say. I think all that we can do is say that in both the case of environmental preservation, which animal welfare desperately needs, we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis and see which might take priority here. And as well as looking at it on a case-by-case basis, we have to step back from it a little bit as human beings and ask, what seems to be? Why are we preserving this? Why are we preserving that? What will the preservation of this mean in terms of individual animals as well as the species of animals, and consider those questions separately, together with perhaps adopting Freya Matthews' idea that we step back as often as we can from this and don't rush in with interference on a line we think it's best to take, but it simply may not be.
Fascinating. Well, Helen, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I think so. This feels like mastermind.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Ooh, no, I can't. It would go so far back, and I'm now so old. I can't recall this at all. I would have to say I was always pro-animal myself, and that from childhood, in a sense, one isn't reading scholarship, of course, but one is reading things that are pro-animal, and that I have always been pro-animal, and where it's very difficult to decide sometimes between environmental preservation and animal welfare, deciding between people and animal welfare has not been a difficult question.
It's not been hard for you? Well, can you recall then the first piece of animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, I can, but it was never published. In 1969 to 72, I was in Canada doing a PhD, and I started on a PhD comparing the way in which animals were treated in 19th century Canadian and 19th century Australian fiction. But after 4 months of doing that, I had to give it up because I found it was just too depressing.
Oh, goodness.
Hunting stories, the attitude to animals, the dismissal of animals as important depressed me so much I simply had to change my topic.
Wow.
So I didn't get back again to animal studies until very late in my career, when I decided before I retired I wanted to teach animal studies, so that people with more of a stomach for confronting the cruelty of human beings in relation to animals, people with more stomach for looking at that could really start studying it seriously. And about that same time, animal studies as a subject in its own right, to my utter delight and amazement, was becoming really not just popular but important and very standard.
Wow, wonderful. Well, Helen, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Look, someone like Val Plumwood is important, and she's not strictly speaking an animal studies person, but like Freya Matthews, who's someone else I find very important, she actually tends to look at animals and environment in a way in which people are not exactly in the background, but she asks us, as does Freya Matthews and a number of other scholars, to ask ourselves about our own placement in the world and our own relation to animals, and why we have always felt we are the ones to prioritise. You live in a human society, you're stuck with that kind of prioritising, and you do it yourself. But I've always felt I was in some alien world where the values were wrong. And I think both Val Plumwood and Freya Matthews ask us to step back again and look at ourselves in relation to this world. What is it that makes us think we have a priority here, that our issues are the important ones, not the others?
Interesting. Well, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, I think there's probably a lot of things. I think animal studies is becoming a wonderful subject and a wonderful area for people to move into. And I have still a great belief in the idea of a university, the idea that research within a university, through teaching, through writing, can in fact filter down and change ideas in the community. It's slow though, so one gets quite impatient with the amount of time this takes. So activism of various kinds, if you are able to do it, is also very good. From joining protests about live sheep export or live cattle export, for instance, to the people I regard as extraordinarily brave who can actually go into factory farms, take photos of what's going on and show the world what is going on. This will wash over some people, but I think it does make a difference to others. So while I think academics do a great deal through teaching and research, they may also be involved in activism, as I said, from joining protests, donating to various groups that in fact try to promote animal welfare, whether it's wild animal welfare or domestic animal welfare, to those, as I say, that I admire most of all, that have the bravery to confront the kinds of horrible things we do to animals and go in and film and demonstrate to the world what we do to animals, which is not pretty.
Indeed. Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I have to think about that because I would. There's a wonderful novel, and unfortunately I cannot think of the author or the title immediately, except to say it begins in Cape Grim, and it's written by one very famous ABC presenter, back a bit, about the way in which the animals managed to take over the world. It's obviously a fantasy, but it has a slightly serious edge to it. And the animals managed to stop human activity in various ways by getting all the birds together and stopping flights, airline flights, until they get some rights. Now, of course, as I say, this is utter fantasy, but it's quite exhilarating to read. And if I could change one thing, I would like to see animals have their rightful place in the world, at least equal to us, and perhaps even swung a little bit more their way.
Oh, goodness. Well, Helen, what are you working on next?
I will probably keep working on the Lord Howe Island area for a little bit, but I'm also thinking of working on a project called Damage, in which I look at the way we've moved in the world from what I would call minor damage that we dismissed to what we're looking at now, which I think is major damage, and major damage for humans, but my focus would be damage in relation to animals. But that damage, of course, is going to have massive repercussions on us very soon, unless something is done about climate change, unless something is done about stopping developments of the Adani kind. And I notice with the election coming up that parties are very happy to throw money at environmental issues, unhappily not so much at animal issues, but they will throw money at environmental issues, but they will do nothing to stop the kinds of habitat loss that in fact are what matters. You won't stop a mining project, you won't stop fracking, and it's stopping these things that parties need to do, not just throwing money at environmental matters to get the vote.
So a lot of work to be done yet for you, Helen. And how can people find out more about your work? That's a bit more difficult. Google?
Yes, I mean, Google and Wikipedia, I guess, is the places to look, though I'm not sure how much of the animal studies area gets on Wikipedia. I'm a bit of a technophobe. And I have never really caught up with the whole net idea.
Yes.
So...
Well, people can put your name into Google Scholar. They can put your name into Google, and they can also keep an eye on Amazon or the university library for your latest publications.
I suppose that's true.
Yeah,
Yes.
So they'll find, if they want to find you, they'll find you. Well, Helen, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
Thank you, Siobhan.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, the sound engineer on this episode was Oliver Lazaris, and he's an animal studies scholar and also a radio producer. Now, we are on social media over here at Knowing Animals HQ, so you can follow us on Twitter at Knowing_Animals, and you can also like us on Facebook. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes, as reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.